Having looked at the difference between ethics and other standards, the next thing that we need to look at is this idea of ethical relativism. So at its heart, this is the question of whether there is one approach to a topic or an issue that is ethical, or whether the approach can still be ethical if it varies by the situation or even the person. And so let's dive into that and have a look at some of the ideas surrounding this issue. Very clearly, ethical standards vary from culture to culture. We know that because in different parts of the world there are different laws, religions, etiquette, etc. So that leads some people to say that what's ethically right, so what is ethical in a particular situation, can vary depending on the culture. At its heart, this is saying that there is no absolute ethical position around issues. It's all relative. You could also extend this to the individual level, saying what's ethically right or wrong in a particular situation can vary depending upon the actual person that we're dealing with. So this is what we mean by a claim of ethical relativism, or sometimes it's called cultural relativism. Many examples. Here's one before you: an executive's looking to hire someone new, and at the moment the entire team's male. So he gets some applications from well-qualified women, but refuses to hire them because he thinks it's going to disrupt the team dynamics. So if we were moral relativists, we could say that that choice could be right in a certain culture. In this culture, we might say this decision is right, but it would be wrong in a different culture. Moral relativists could also say that it's right for this individual, for this executive, right? It helps them in their role, but it could be wrong for a different executive. And so we'd have no absolute answer to this kind of conundrum. Do we not appoint someone who's well qualified because of the team dynamics? For a couple of reasons, most ethicists don't accept ethical relativism. So two of the core problems that have been identified is the fact that while moral standards vary, it doesn't mean that they're relative. So it actually says that, hey, maybe some moral standards are actually wrong. We know that many different cultures have beliefs, even around facts, and that these can be wrong. So why would it not then follow that moral standards in some cultures or societies might be wrong? It also raises the interesting issue of how we operationalize a moral standard. So, and the example given here is the Inuit practice of leaving the elderly to die alone in the cold, right? Well, if we look at that, we can say, geez, that's unethical, allowing people to die in the cold. But if we reframe that and say, look, the ethic here is that in harsh circumstances, it's appropriate that some people sacrifice to protect the community, that gives us a different ethical light. So often the rule or the practice, leaving elderly to die in the cold, may be just an operationalization of an underlying ethical position, and that there aren't these huge differences that we see. What we see is a difference in how people enact that ethical standard rather than what it actually is. So for those couple of reasons, a lot of moral philosophers would argue ethical relativism is not terribly helpful. And that conclusion is quite important. What it leads us to is the idea that we can start to judge ethical acts across time and space and cultures. Because if ethical relativism holds, then we actually couldn't criticize anyone's practices. We can't morally condemn slavery in a different time period or even in a different culture, right? Because we could argue that because of relativism, it's actually ethical in that particular circumstance. It's also, if relativism were true, it would also mean that we wouldn't be able to judge things according to our standards, right? Our own standards wouldn't be able to be criticized, and we wouldn't be able to actually progress or develop our moral approach. So at the core of these three problems with ethical relativism is the idea that we actually can't judge whether something is ethical or not if we do actually subscribe to ethical relativism. We couldn't judge anything because we're not allowed to criticize others. We couldn't even judge our own because our own standards can't be criticized. And if it's true, we can't develop ethically and morally. So two potential misunderstandings that occur with the rejection of ethical relativism are listed here on this slide. And what it's really trying to tell us is that just because we reject ethical relativism, it doesn't mean that we assume that our practices are the best, right? We can still learn from the practices and assumptions of those around the world. That should help us clarify and to develop our own moral practices better. So just because we reject relativism doesn't mean that we're right. We could actually be the people who are wrong. And that can work both at a cultural, organisational and individual level. It also doesn't mean that we don't understand the role of the situation or context in an ethical decision. So just because we reject ethical relativism, it doesn't mean that we don't accept that you might do something ethically different in a different situation. We don't need to just have this one overall legalistic approach to how to solve things. And we'll go into what that actually means when we start using different tools later on in the course. So rejecting ethical relativism means only that ethical choice in a particular situation applies to everyone in that situation. So there's lots of potential things for us as business people that come out of this rejection of ethical relativism. Okay, first is we can continue to develop and learn and better our own ethical responses. Second is just because we've done something in the past, or this is the way we do it in our organisation or our society, or the way I've done it, doesn't mean that it's right for the future. So we've really got to be careful of that, and we need to be able to learn from others as part of that process. It also means that when we're working cross-culturally in different nations, we may not want to accept their cultural or ethical standards and do business their way. That's an important decision that we need to make in terms of how we apply ethics in our lives and organisations. So that's a bit of an overview about ethical relativism. The final segment for our first set of vodcasts is going to deal with the role of organisational context and the situation we find ourselves in when we make ethical decisions. How does that affect the ethical decisions that we make?